was carefully planned. The elite and illegal rearmament of the covert army was carefully staged after World War I. That's where Gehlen began. Hundreds of political assassinations took place, which I've talked about before. And Richard Nixon was the front man selected to lead this group into the Cold War and to the brink of a hot war, if necessary, using the Gehlen agents. About Nixon, I wrote that the warfare state that was set free in November 22nd, 1963, began when John Foster Dulles was Secretary of the State from 1953 to 59. His brother Allen Dulles headed the OSS, and was in the OSS, and then headed the CIA, and they literally ran this government. When Adolf Hitler declared war in 1941, Allen Dulles went over to Switzerland to round up Germans, so when the war was ended, we could use them in the United States. From 1945 to 1952, 642 specialists were brought over here. They were violently anti-communist. They worked with the military and the munitions makers. They were members of the Nazi Party. They were brought here for key positions in universities, factories, aircraft, aerospace. And when Reinhard Gehlen joined forces with our OSS and the CIA, he was back in business and working for the United States. After a series of meetings arranged by the Pentagon with Nazi Gehlen, Allen Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover, and others formed the Gehlen Organization. An espionage network was set up, engaged in clandestine political action to stir revolt, overthrow governments, and bring about political change. Of course, after John Kennedy was murdered, we had the overthrow of Brazil into a police state in Dominican Republic, and all the Latin American countries began to go fascist. And then in that article, after that background on Gehlen, I wrote, enter Richard Nixon, who applied for being in the FBI when he was out of law school. He was a lieutenant commander in the Navy. He was put into a position in Long Island where the Nazis were brought to this country, and later it was confirmed in other books how his office in Whittier was a front for the Nazis. And this article goes into the Cold War, the Alger Hiss story of using a German spy to set up Richard Nixon to frame the peace conferences, the United Nations, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Allen Dulles sent Alger Hiss to all of these meetings and then linked him with a man who later would say that he was a communist. Isaac Don Levine, like Reinhard Gehlen, and Frank Nodge is another one of these tapestries that is woven in, as I mentioned before, in the history. These tapestries weave in and out. I wrote in 72, the anniversary 7 years ago, I wrote Isaac Don Levine is the man that took Whittaker Chambers by the arms, a reluctant Chambers, and arranged the meetings that would smear Alger Hiss, and this would catapult Richard Nixon's fight into the Cold War, which is what Gehlen and the agents wanted by finding a communist in Washington. It was no coincidence that Isaac Don Levine would be meeting with Marina Oswald, the widow of Lee Harvey Oswald, and getting in a huddle to exchange a communist story out of a CIA plot. This is what Levine was doing with Whittaker Chambers. It's what he was doing with Marina Oswald. He worked with the Reinhard Gehlen machinery. That was taken from John J. McCloy's minutes of the Warren Commission meetings on January 21st, 1964. Isaac Levine was getting a communist story of the CIA plot with Marina Oswald. I also wrote 7 years ago that Richard Nixon, like Adolf Hitler, is a patchwork quilt. Both men represent the sum total of murders, secret plans, behind-the-scene covert imaginations that created their existence. They were hand-sewn and designed by identical masters: Germany, the Nazi Party, the United States military, and the intelligence machine. They are in power today. They continue mass murders, political assassinations. They scrape the bottom of the ocean, the surface of the moon, the face of the earth for oil, gold, minerals, and resources within their grasp. And I wrote, it is the moral obligation of human beings to halt this hunger for power and legalize greed toward the majority of people on planet Earth. And I also wrote that huge summit meetings, a false sense of euphoria preceding elections, does not conceal increased budgets for weapons, new laws for repression, or further concentration in the White House. The SALT talks, the Begin, Sadat talks, the high summit meetings Don't get your false sense of euphoria worked up about peace. Read your papers every day, like I do, and you'll know that this is a BS cover-up until the big Brahu comes down. I wrote the family of humanity is not represented by the strategists, who are few in number and still hold on to their power. I wrote that in 1972, and I also wrote that Nixon's power in 1972